faces, but not everyone. So hello. My name is Satnam Chahal. I'm a district principal here in Inclusive Learning. I'm very happy to welcome you here. I'll be co-presenting with Neil Stevenson today. Neil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Neil Stevenson, Director of Learning Services. And Satnam and I are going to be doing this together for the next 6 weeks, and hopefully he'll join us for all of them.
Great. Okay, so as we begin, I'd like to just take a moment to really acknowledge the fact that, since we're all in Delta, we're meeting on the traditional territories and lands of the Musqueam and Tsawwassen First Nations. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize that today is May 5th, also known as Red Shirt Day. It's a day where, across the country, folks are taking a moment to recognize the real harm that has come to Indigenous communities and Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited people in particular. This is a day that is partly come out of the inquiry relating to murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. I would say if it's something that you're not very familiar with, it's certainly something that's worth learning about. And I'd like to just ask that we just take 30 seconds just to kind of recognize the nature of the day, and then we'll move on with our presentation. All right, so this is, sorry, I'm just gonna have to move my screen just a little bit for myself. Whoops. Let's see if I can go back. So here we are. This is session 1 of 6. Altogether, these sessions, are focused on how we learn. We're certainly hopeful, as Neil stated earlier, that you'll be able to join us for each of the sessions. They're 45 minutes each, so we'll be doing our best to move at a brisk pace, and also provide opportunities for folks to jump in. The series itself, just to kind of set it up as we start off here, really draws on 3 distinct but related sources. So the first 2 sources are really research-oriented sources. So we're talking about educational psychology and cognitive psychology in particular, where a lot of work has been done for many, many decades on looking at how learning, memory, knowledge, retrieval, all of these sorts of things work. I would say traditionally, a lot of that research was very oriented to young adults, usually students in psychology classrooms. But over time, it's shifted, and the real significant shift in focus has taken place as folks look at K-12 educational settings instead. And this is where there's a nice overlap with a lot of research that looks at what sorts of practices are particularly accessible, inclusive, and impactful in everyday classrooms. So that's the effective teaching research. So those are sorts of the 2 main research literatures that we're drawing on for this series. And it's really amplified, and I would say synthesized, in social networks like Twitter, and a whole series of educators who are blogging really actively about using these strategies in their classrooms. So we'll be engaging with all 3 of these and be sharing more information about them. But I just wanted to share that with you first. I said this is sometimes called the science of learning. Really, I should have said this is often called the science of learning. So as we work through this series, if you want to jump in or jump ahead, you can literally just Google science of learning and you'll come across all sorts of related resources. So why have a series on how we learn? Well, there's a whole there's a whole bunch of good reasons we think that this is a good use of your time. First, all of us have personal and very kind of functional theories of what it means to learn and how we learn. This informs all of our teaching decisions when we're working with students as well. These kind of foundational factors of memory, thinking, processing, retrieval, and knowledge, they're always implicated in learning. It's hard to think. We're not going to take time to think this through, but I would say it's really difficult to think of an example where they're not implicated in kind of the teaching and learning exchange. As well, we thought this would be a really helpful series because we really wanted to share with you those networks or that ecosystem of folks out there who are applying these strategies in their classrooms. As well, there's a bit of an elephant in the room, maybe, maybe not. And that is, we thought this was an important series because it seems to be a conversation that we haven't really made a lot of time for. The shift to the new curriculum was really important. It's opened up a lot of possibilities and a lot of conversations. They tend to be a little more oriented towards the bigger picture, which is really important. But at the same time, it's important for us to make space for these more foundational conversations. The most important reason, I would say for Neil and I for sure, that's kind of driving our thinking and bringing this series forward is because we think this would make a difference for students and we think it would make a difference for teachers. The more informed we are about how learning happens, the more able we are to meet the needs of our students. That said, here's a bit of a qualifier. We're focusing on, I used the word ecosystem before, it's an ecosystem of applied research that's pretty tightly bound, right? So I showed you those sources before. Now, the good thing is that these sources or resources that we're looking at are really scientifically based. And the nice thing about that is there's no real mystery about the claims that are being made. They're very evidence referenced, they're very explicit, and they're ones that are easy to dig into as we move ahead. At the same time, you know, a psychological approach to understanding how folks learn is but one perspective, right? So we would say that this is a perspective that is largely neglected and a lot of everyday efforts around supporting students and supporting teachers. So that's why we think it's important to engage with it. But at the same time, it's but one perspective, right? So we would invite you to engage with this critically and reflexively and always to connect back to the bigger picture. Now, what's that bigger picture? Well, as a district, we've been engaging with a whole series of important perspectives over the past number of years, right? I mean, this is only a partial list. The thing about teaching is that you end up holding kind of the complexity of a lot of different perspectives, and then you end up drawing on those really strategically as you move forward. So what we see is that the information that we're going to be sharing with you should help to underpin and inform your engagement with what you see in front of you on the screen. But at the same time, it might also prompt you to kind of rethink some of your assumptions about learning too. So let's consider these connections and implications together as we move forward in the series. So just a few tips for engagement. Apply this content to your context. You know, we would definitely invite you to take some of these ideas and some of these strategies for a sprint. What you're going to find, to be just completely transparent, is that this first session is a little bit more of laying the groundwork. It might feel just a little bit more theoretical than practical, whereas our subsequent sessions will have all sorts of real practical tools and strategies that would really lend themselves to a trial in a classroom. So applying content to your context is obviously very important as well. Would really invite you to ask questions and seek clarification. Our commitment to you, to put it really simply, is to be really explicit. We're not sharing with you, you know, the A to Z of how learning happens, but we are sharing with you consensus points that we think would be really valuable. And what we'll do as we share those with you is be really clear about where they're coming from, so that you can dig in deeper. Now, just a friendly reminder, for all new learning, we're always having to navigate biases, right? I mean, there's a built-in tendency for all of us to kind of stick with the status quo. This is, probably there's all sorts of really great evolutionary reasons for that. But at the same time, when we can take a step back and recognize that there's that kind of innate orientation to maybe stick with the status quo, then we have a chance to move beyond it too, right? And this is actually, kind of an exercise that comes out of cognitive science. So we just want to just a reminder, right? To, as you're thinking reflexively and critically, do keep an eye out for these sorts of things, right? Confirmation bias is probably the most widely known bias, I think. Just that tendency to notice or focus on what you already know and to look for evidence that backs that up. But the other three here, bandwagon effect, base rate fallacy, and a sunk cost fallacy, I think these can be significant as well. What I won't do is I won't read through all of them right now. I would just encourage you to have an open mind and to think critically as we move ahead here together. This was a slide that we had actually debated on whether or not including in this session or a subsequent session. It's actually really, I think it's quite provocative. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of John Hattie. He is an educational researcher who's quite well known for recent work that he's done around meta-analysis and sort of synthesizing, what works in education. He's a bit of a contentious figure. I would say there's, there's all sorts of debates about some of his really specific claims. But one thing that there isn't really very much debate on, I would argue, is a consensus point, is this idea that there's good news in education. And the good news is almost everything we choose to do with students positively impacts student learning. So that's great. But there's a nuance to that, and it's a bit of bad news, and that is not everything works as well. So it much of it makes a positive impact, but it's a differential impact. And there's a cost of lost opportunities there for our most vulnerable learners. So that's why it's always on us to have these sorts of critical shared conversations, so we can always think through what our options are, so we can make the best strategic decisions for our students. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing here, and Neil will start sharing his screen for the next part. Oh, Neil, you're muted.
Okay, there you go. Sorry, I was just getting my slide to the right one. So thanks, Satnam, for that intro. And again, as Satnam said, today is going to be a little bit more on the kind of theoretical side. We wanted to do that intro to sort of set the picture of what we're about, some of the sources and the reasons that we're here. I know for myself, I've kind of committed quite a bit of the last 2-3 years of my life to really digging deeply into educational research, to try to get my head around what works. And some of it's provocative, some of it has been difficult because it isn't, to be honest, it isn't always the stuff that I thought is the stuff I wanted to read when I went to the educational research. And so that's part of kind of that cognitive bias side that we're looking at. Is what we're hoping is we can take a look at these things and possibly, you know, suspend the things that we think are the best and allow a bit of space to potentially be pushed in a different way. So to get started, what I would like you to do, first of all, for me, is we've just been talking for a bit. We're going to give you 3 minutes. I'm set the timer. You have 3 minutes on a piece of paper just by yourself to just write down what is your current understanding of how learning happens. It could be a picture, it could be some bullet points, it could be whatever you want, but you got 3 minutes. All right, halfway there, 90 seconds left. I know it's a huge topic, but just kind of the highlight points of how you think learning happens. All right, 30 seconds left. Don't worry, you're not sharing with anybody, so it's not complete. It's okay, it's just for yourself. Okay, I'll ask you to wrap up. And next thing we're going to do, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit. The next thing I want you to do, I'm going to try a poll here. I've never done a poll before, but I've got a question for you. And I know this might be difficult for those of you with a bunch of people in one room, but the poll is, how would you respond to the statement? And it's one that I've heard quite a lot in the last definitely decade or two, which is, we live in the 21st century. We are surrounded by devices that can look up any piece of information, any fact, any formula in the blink of an eye. So why would we want to commit? Why have kids commit things to memory? Why commit things to memory if we can just look things up? So the question is, do you, and I'll put the poll up, oops, put the poll up. I can't. Do you, let's see if this works. You should be able to answer. Did that pop up? Show up on anyone's screen? Oh, good. Never done a poll before. Do you agree, strongly disagree? Let's just see what comes in. Okay, a couple more. I think, is everyone 15? I don't think. Satnam, did you vote? Come on,
Yes,
Satnam,
sir.
throw in the strongly. You're the strong. Throw in a strongly agree for us. Okay, we'll come back. So then we're going to come back to this question in a little bit. So interesting kind of a spread there. No strongly agrees, but there are some agrees, mostly disagrees, and some strongly disagrees. I would say it is something that's been it does get you. I've heard it so many times over the last couple of decades at conferences and Twitter and things. So we will come back to that. So quick little bit of what we're going to go over today. As we said, it's going to be a little bit more on the theoretical side, but we're going to talk about memory. We're going to start with memory because memory is going to really be a thread that runs through this entire 6-week course. Hopefully we don't lose you today because the other ones are going to be a lot more practical and classroom practice focused, but that's going to be a real thread. We're going to look quickly at a couple types of memory, a couple models of learning, and then we're going to talk a little bit about forgetting. And there's some really interesting things about forgetting that is also going to be an important thread as we go through the series and go through different principles. So we're going to start by talking about, this is our main big first idea of this series, is we're going to use this idea. I've heard it a bunch of times from Dylan William. He stole it from someone else, a couple other researchers. But the idea is that there's lots of different views of learning. There's lots of different ways to conceptualize it. The one that we're kind of using here, and that I think is quite applicable in its simplicity, is this learning is a change in long-term memory. Or another way to think of that is just learning is a long-term change in what we know or are able to do. And so we say that we have learned something when once some time has passed, we were able to do that thing or know that thing, right? So we imagine kids moving through 13 years in our classrooms. We want to have a significant change over that time in what they know and what they're able to do. And it's going to be that long-term piece, which is going to be, again, another theme that's going to come back that's going to be really important for us as we go through it. All right, so that's going to be our touch point for today. Why are we talking about memory? As Satnam said earlier, memory is not necessarily something that is trendy or talked about a lot. I don't know that I've been to a lot of conferences or workshops in the last, I've been in BC now for 10 years. I don't know that I've really been to a lot of conferences that talk about memory. We talk about a lot of other things, but so why are we talking about memory? Well, from a cognitive science, neuroscience perspective, we want a pretty broad understanding of memory here. Memory is everything that has ever been experienced, that you have ever experienced, or that's represented in the neural networks in your brain, right? All your memories from your past, your sensations, your perceptions, your knowledge, your skills, your competencies, all the things that you're able to do are stored in there somewhere, right? And so that's the view of memory that we're talking about, all the stuff that is encoded in our brain. Paul Kirchner, who's an influential guy we've read lots of, saying that long-term memory is sort of this central dominant structure of cognition, thinking, processing, okay? And the last one, a great a website that we're going to come back to a bunch of times. Some of you who are pre-registered got a bunch of books. There's a book that we handed out called Understanding How We Learn, great book. They talk about, their definition is that we would argue that everything you do requires memory, right? Speaking, reading, recognizing faces that are on the screen, all these things, from our very simple ways we interact with the world to the deep higher order thinking that we want for kids. It all requires memory, okay? A couple of different types of memory. And again, not getting too deep into it, but there are lots of other sort of models of memory that cognitive scientists will talk about. The one that we're going to use here is that basically a big split between implicit and explicit, sometimes called declarative and non-declarative. Implicit is non-declarative. It's the stuff you can't explain. So it's all the unconscious things that are going on. Sometimes it's wrapped up with your body systems, like breathing. Like, you don't think about breathing. That's part of what's going on, but it's It's all the things you can't explain, like riding a bike. We can talk about some of the principles, but the actual physical experience of how to shift your balance and ride a bike is what we would call implicit. All right. And then we have a whole another body of memories called explicit, which is the stuff that we can talk about, we can explain. And that, for our purposes, is split into two smaller categories: semantic and episodic. Okay. Semantic is the stuff that is all of the facts, dates, numbers, words, concepts, the stuff that is sort of what we often consider knowledge. Okay, that's our semantic. The episodic is our experiences. That's our autobiographical memory. It's the things that we've experienced in our lives. And what's interesting, actually, well, I won't say that. There's some interesting stuff about that. One of the things to keep in mind about these two, which is super important, is that in a maybe an oversimplistic way, episodic is often tied to time and place. It's very contextual. Okay. And so my memories of a particular thing that I did, let's say when we're often asked to think back of really fond memories of school, for example, right? When you think back about memories of school, you will be thinking of episodic memories, maybe fond, maybe not. You maybe have some very sadly traumatic memories of school, but that's episodic. It's time. It's really tied to the context that it happened. Semantic, what's interesting is we don't usually remember the time and space that we learned those. They become taken away from the context in which we learned them. So what that often does, one of the things to be aware of, is we can often in education, I think, overemphasize episodic, because those are the memories we have about school. But all the knowledge that we built up that helps us read and think and learn and problem solve, we don't remember a lot of that. So we sometimes, I think, can devalue semantic because we don't have the contextual memories that go along with it. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting, I find that to be an interesting little piece there. Okay, so that's the little bit on background on memory. Now we want to talk about some models of memory. Again, I like this quote from Dylan Wiliam. I've heard him say it a few times. All models are wrong. Some are useful. So these couple of models we're going to talk about, they are not comprehensive. They are not the complete picture of how learning happens, but we think that they are useful and they're very the first one in particular is quite widely used in some of the research that Satnam and I have been looking at. So we're going to talk about this, what's called the Willingham Simple Model of Memory. It's from and just a reminder as well, all the slides, this is being recorded and all the slides are available as well. So in case people are whipping down notes. This is the Willingham Simple Model of Memory. Basically, our learning starts with perception, attention to a particular thing in the environment. At any given moment, we're bombarded with literally millions of pieces of information, sights, sounds, things that we could pay attention to. And we can only pay attention to a very few of them. And so the starting point is attention. And so if you think of a classroom, that has implications for kids. There's very few things that the kids can pay attention to. And we want to make sure in a future workshop, we're going to talk about that. How do we get kids to pay attention to the things that we want them to? So that's the starting point. What we pay attention to and what we're thinking about as we're conscious of right now is what's going on in your working memory, or your short-term memory, sometimes called. Okay, there are now decades of research on this. Working memory basically can hold 3 to 5 items, give or take, depending on different people's short-term memory abilities and things like your fatigue and your state that you're in and emotion, things like that. But basically 3 to 5, and it doesn't last very long. It's pretty fragile. Everyone's had experiences of trying to remember a phone number or someone's name who they just met, and that it's very fragile and it just disappears. Okay, so that's our working memory. That's going to be really important, because there's some limits around working memory that we need to be aware of in a future session. Learning, in that Dylan Wiliam quote, learning is the is the change in long-term memory. So it's getting the stuff we want into long-term memory, okay? Because that's where the long-term change happens. So that's what the process, kind of this model of learning speaks to. And long-term memory, according to most cognitive scientists that I've been reading, is sort of limitless in size. There's no limit to the amount of information, knowledge, facts, skills, concepts that somebody can have in their long-term memory. There's also some who say that actually everything that ever goes in there never disappears. We just can't retrieve it. And there's others who think differently. But so some say it's limitless in time, but the general consensus is that it's limitless in size. Okay. And then our remembering, the act of remembering, is bringing something from long-term memory back into working memory. You know, as we are working on something, reading a book, whatever it happens to be, we're pulling information from our memory and we're using it to process whatever's going on at a given moment. And another kind of interesting little thing I threw in here, what we have in our long-term memory and our working memory actually shapes what we see and hear. Okay. And I like the idea, you could think of it as a listening to a piece of music. Somebody who has very little musical background will actually hear music differently than somebody who is an expert in music, right? All that stuff is in the song already, the piece of music, but it's the expertise that we've built up that allows us to hear the complexity of music in different ways, right? So even our perception, what we see, is shaped. An artist will see the world differently than I would see the world, because I've kind of talked to my wife, I'm terrible with colors and arts and that kind of stuff. But my wife would see the world in a different way because of some of the training she's done in art. Okay, so that's the Willingham model. Okay, how does stuff get into long-term memory? Okay, so we're going to turn to the second model we're going to talk about. So this is the idea of building long-term memory representations. This comes from a cognitive scientist named Efrat First. Her website is fantastic, has lots of really good practical stuff for teachers. And basically, this is the model. The model is kind of generally accepted of how things get consolidated. This is a model of, you know, we know that they're in the brain. There are neurons that get connected. And so this is a picture of before an initial encounter with a piece of information. And what's really interesting is, like, what I want you to take away from even just that is, before we've even encountered something, there's stuff there, right? We encounter everything we encounter that's new. We encounter it through what we already know. Super important, right? That's why one of the most replicable findings from education research, cognitive science, is that background knowledge, prior knowledge, is one of the largest influences on future learning. Okay, what's already in there shapes what can get in there next. Okay, so the steps that this cognitive scientist explains is that when we go to know something, so there's a new little representation there to know. What she says is, this is the most basic representation in the brain. It's very fragile. It's not connected to anything, and it's typically at this point only recognition only. So when kids are learning letter shapes, right? They're very fragile. They may be able to recognize the shape, but they may not be able to write it yet or use it yet. We may learn a new word, a new concept in something we're learning, and we can sort of recognize that thing, but we can't use it yet. Okay. Then we move to understanding, and notice that understanding starts to connect. What shapes understanding is its connection with other things. Okay, and this is where meaning gets attached. We shape what we come to know and understand based on the integration of new ideas with what we already know. Okay, at this point, it's still quite demanding on the brain, still quite demanding on what we call the cognitive load that we're going to get to in a couple of weeks. And so it takes a lot of effort still to work with this. It's not fluent yet, but there's some meaning attached. And then we get to using, and you'll see that there's now starting to be a pathway And the more an idea, a concept, a skill gets used, the more the pathways build over time, right? The phrase is that neurons that fire together, wire together. The more we use something, the more we recall, the more we apply things in different ways, the more it gets cemented in our brains. And finally, we have master, which is multiple use in different contexts. It's easily used. And notice that it's really connected across lots of pathways, right? So that's kind of the progression of an idea. And one thing that's super important here is that notice that depth of thinking is not necessarily separate from the knowledge. Depth of thinking is a result of the connections. So the more knowledge that we have and the connections between our knowledge is what actually produces using and mastery, okay? That's another idea that's gonna be really, really kind of a thread throughout our time together. So this is the idea of consolidation, that new memories are consolidated, they're attached, they're connected, they get stronger. And this is the basis of neuroplasticity, which you may have heard of, which is our brain actually physically changes and can continue through our entire life. And that the brain can repair itself and take on different tasks even if parts of the brain are damaged. And so, fascinating what the brain is able to do. From a learning perspective, so if we go back to that last idea, the final square, that's what we would call a schema. Okay, a schema is sort of a well-developed concept. It may be a schema might be a word, right? Let's say you take a word like democracy. A word like democracy through our lifetimes gets richer and richer and richer as the schema around it grows and grows and grows. Okay. Now remember back to that's one of the slides about the working memory. We only have 3 to 5 things that we can hold in our working memory, but each of those can be a chunk from a cognitive science perspective. So the richer the schemas that we bring in, the more our thinking, the more it drives the depth of our thinking in our working memory, okay? So let me, a couple more slides and then I'll stop and give you a little bit of think time. One of the things that I think is really important here, and this guy, Daniel Willingham's an author that I've read a lot the last couple of years. I really like his stuff. We often come across this idea that rote learning is bad, right? Memorizing things is bad, and absolutely it is if we stop there. But what I like is he frames it early learning, kind of the first steps in that kind of process that we just saw, not as rote, but inflexible. And I find that a more useful definition. And what he says is inflexible knowledge is unavoidable. We have to go through that stage. New information enters long-term memory tied to the context in which it was learned. Remember, that was sort of the episodic, the early learning that we have about something is often tied to that. Over time, it gets more semantic. So it's a natural step on the way to the deeper knowledge we want students to have. And then I really like this. What turns the inflexible knowledge of a beginner into the flexible knowledge of an expert seems to be more knowledge, more examples, more connections, more processing, more practice. So I like that idea myself. It really resonates with me of rather than thinking of surface knowledge as bad, there is no bad knowledge. Knowledge is useful when it becomes connected and flexible and applied, right? And so for me, that's been a really helpful kind of way of thinking of it. Another way to think of it, back to Efrat first, she says this: yes, rote memorization is not what we're talking about. We don't want just unusable pieces of knowledge. That's what school has sometimes been in the past. But we do want schemas. We want structures of knowledge. But what that means is, the argument is that just because rote memorization doesn't build the deep thinking that we want, doesn't mean that we don't need the bricks. We still absolutely need the bricks. And I think, as Satnam said earlier on, I think some of these ideas about knowledge and memory aren't necessarily regular conversations in our talk of the BC curriculum. And I know that lots of places I've been to will downplay content. And I think what I've been reading the last few years, I think it's a dangerous place for us to be going, to be downplaying content. And I'm not at all saying that we go back. We're not advocating here for back to memorizing a whole bunch of disconnected facts. But a lot of the competencies you want for kids are really built on rich knowledge. Okay. So I'll just give you a couple thoughts here, and then I'll give you some time to think about it. So implications of this: depth of thinking is a result of the quality of the connections that exist in our neural pathways. Effective teaching strives to build schemas, right? We're trying to build rich, connected, flexible knowledge. We understand things in the context of things we already know. The more you know, the more quickly you can acquire and integrate new learning. Effective teaching considers prior knowledge of learners. That's a huge thread in educational research. And finally, in many areas of learning, knowledge and skills accumulate in specific ways. Effective teaching carefully considers the sequencing of knowledge and skill development. And so mathematics is a great example. There are things that build in really important, predictable, disciplinary ways. And if students don't build up the schemas in the correct ways, it causes problem. We sometimes hear that, well, content is interchangeable and it doesn't matter what students are studying. And I think there are places when that's absolutely the case, and there are places when that is, I think, detrimental to student learning. The key for us is to figure out what are some of those core areas, core concepts, core things that are going to build student success. Let me skip this because we're going slower than I hoped. So I'll give you a couple minutes and let's stop there and just give you some time to write for a couple minutes. And if you have questions, if there are questions that are popping up and you want to throw them in the chat, definitely you can, if things that are emerging. And those of you that are kind of in rooms, if you want some time to use the time to chat a little bit. Okay, let me ask if you can do this for me. If you can, in the chat, just so we can get a little bit of interaction, if there's kind of something that stood out to you, an idea, something you're challenged by, something you're questioning, or something you disagree with, anything. If you just want to throw kind of one thought in the chat, that would be great. Okay, here's the dilemma we got. We have another piece that we wanted to go to, but we have not judged our time well. So we got about 15 minutes left. How do people feel about, I mean, you can leave if you need to. We'll keep doing the next 15 minutes. It'll be recorded. But the next part is we'll get through as quick as we can, but totally understand that people need to leave. And we promise and commit that in the future, we will not go past 4 o'clock. Because again, this was sort of one that was kind of laying the foundation for things. A couple of good questions in here. Huge implications for math, yeah. Huge implications for everything. How do you help students store knowledge? That is going to be one of our, that's when we hit the practical stuff, this is going to be all the stuff that kind of fits into this model of learning. So again, ask your patience for this one, and then we're going to get into some of those things, classroom routines next time. And my understanding from Kay's question, my understanding is that there could be a little bit of improvement of working memory, but not really. There's been a lot of games and brain gym and all these types of things that have kind of been fallacies in terms of claiming that they can improve some of that. There is some things that we can do to get our working memory better, but it's most of the research is saying it's the things that are the connections in the long-term memory that are making a huge difference. Yes, Jason, huge question there.
I would just jump in and say, with some irony, there are definitely ways that we can compromise students' working memory. For example,
yes.
You know, having them attend math class and have their phone beside them is a good way of what they're able to focus on.
So let me keep going, because we want to hit one more piece and we'll get through it as quickly as we can. But I understand if people need to leave. Here's the second part: forgetting. Forgetting is super interesting to me. Here's a quote I came up with. I know I taught this last year. I know last year's teacher taught it. Why can't they remember it? Okay. The thing that I've been learning, that Sat and I talk about, is learning is a natural thing. And we're going to go back to this guy here, whose name is Hermann Ebbinghaus. Back about 150 years ago, he started, 150 years ago, he started studying memory, and he came up with this thing called the forgetting curve. It's been replicated lots and lots of times over the last century. And basically, it's the idea that new information, new things that enter our brain disappear at a pretty predictable rate. Now, I'm a little skeptical of the numbers, because there's other influences that play into this. Things like our motivation, our emotional connection to the learning. All of those sorts of things definitely aren't represented here. But the important thing that this tells us is that there is a very significant drop in learning right away when we encounter new things, and it's fairly predictable. Okay, it's called the forgetting curve, and it's going to be super important for us when we think about how to help kids, because the brain naturally forgets. Cognitive scientists here from McGill, we forgetting something isn't like a glitch in the brain. It's the fact that it's part of the natural processing, natural functioning of the brain. If your brain didn't forget, it wouldn't be functioning properly. And I trying to figure out why that is. And I couldn't find any real consensus. There's a couple of interesting theories. One is that not everything is worth remembering. There is a condition where people remember almost everything that's happened to them, and it's not a pleasant experience. And so even from a trauma perspective, being able to forget things is a gift. Forgetting, the brain itself doesn't know importance, but by forgetting and then recalling and then strengthening, we can give importance to things that we want. The other thing I think that's quite interesting, and it goes back to that episodic and semantic, is that forgetting and then retrieving or recalling, what we're going to talk about next week, actually starts to decontextualize learning and makes it more applicable. Because the more semantic it is, the less connected it is to a specific context, the more generalizable it is, and then we can apply learning to new contexts, right? Like a word, if you could only ever use a word in the time and place that you learned it, that word's not useful. But by relearning something in multiple places and multiple times, we have to forget it to relearn it to make it useful. So that's kind of something to keep in mind, that when we're thinking about with kids, that them forgetting is not a problem. It's just part of the way the human brain works, okay? And it's the other thing it's useful for me to think is that the dominant metaphor of the brain over the last, 30 years, 40 years has been the brain is like a computer. It has memory, it has storage, it has connections, it has networks, it has wiring, it has encoding, it has electrical signals. So it's a very convenient metaphor. But there's some really key ways why the brain is not like a computer. One of them, super important, it's going to be a theme that we're going to come back to, is in a computer, your processing ability is totally separate from the file structure, right? When you get a new computer, it's all the processing is there. And you can put files on, you can put files off, and you can change the processor, and it doesn't change the files. They're totally separate, right? And the processor works on the files. And we often, I think about this with the brain, where we think, oh, critical thinking, for example, just works on content, right? That we develop critical thinking on some files over here. But that's not, from a cognitive science perspective, they're far more integrated. In our brains, the processor and the file structure are together. There is no separation. Everything we store changes the way we process. So our critical thinking gets better because we have these huge, rich bodies of knowledge. That influences our critical thinking. It's not like we have a split between I can critically think about something. It's that the stuff that I have helps me get better at critical thinking. And when we think about forgetting, some really interesting things here, the mind does not passively or literally record things that you see. It's always, back to what we shared earlier, it's always processing it through what's in there before, through our cognitive biases. It's always searching for meaning. And so we don't create literal snapshots. Different people who experience the same event experience it differently because of what they bring to it. And this is going to be super important as we come next week. Every time we forget something and we recall it, it changes, it gets reconstructed. So on a file system, on my laptop, every time I pull up a Word file that I'm working on, it doesn't change unless I change it. But I could pull out the same Word file a whole bunch of times for the rest of the computer's life. And every time I pull it up, it would be identical. Memory is not like that. Every time you bring a memory forward, it changes. And there's some fascinating research that's been done that our memories are quite unreliable. There's a Netflix show I'm going to tell you about at the end, where they followed a bunch of adolescents, interviewed a whole bunch of adolescents at age 15 about their lives, and then interviewed them at age 40 about those same events. Half of the events were wrong. 50% of childhood memories in this study were incorrect, because we recall them, we layer on things, we layer in movies, we layer in stories, and our brains actually change the memories that are in there. And we can have false memories. There's psychological experiments that have been replicated a number of times where psychologists have convinced people that they've committed crimes that they haven't committed, that they've gone to places that they've never gone by planting memories in people. So our brains aren't like these perfect, we don't store learning memories really perfectly. Okay, that's going to be super important when we come to a couple of things in a couple of weeks. So thank you for sticking around. Back to this. Take a minute now and think about all the stuff we just talked about, all that theory. What does it say to this statement? We live in the 21st century surrounded by devices that look up any piece of information in the blink of an eye. Why would you commit anything to memory when you can Google it? Take a second. If you got a couple people in the room, you can talk about it. If you're on your own, you can just kind of think through that. And then we will wrap up in a couple minutes. So this was what I wrote when I thought about that question. The brain is literally reshaped by what it consolidates, what it connects. Our brains think, read, speak, problem solve, even perceive differently based on what we come to internalize and deeply understand. So I think it's a dangerous idea. I think this idea that we can just allow things to be Googled, because the way we literally interact with the world from a cognitive science perspective is all through this filter of everything we've experienced and internalized. And we're gonna, again, these are some big ideas and we're gonna come back to them in different ways over the following weeks and make use of them in the classroom. So let me just, I'm gonna go forward a little bit here. The slides are available for this. A couple of things you may find interesting between now and next week. A couple of just, strictly for your own interest. There's two, if you have Netflix, there's a really interesting Netflix 20-minute video called The Mind Explained. Memory, or if you type in Memory Explained, it pops up. It's 20 minutes. It's very well done, very watchable. And it goes to a lot of kind of what we just talked about and some of the really interesting stuff about more stories about the brain. And then there's another TED Talk there about, and I've linked to that one if you get the slides, how reliable is our memory and some of the more things about the changing nature of our brain. Some documents if you want to look at. We've created each one of these workshops, we're going to create a summary document. And so this one's called The Practice Guide of Memory and Forgetting. There's a great blog post by an author who I really, really like, which kind of goes through the Willingham model and why it's important to have a theory of learning, what some of the implications are. So that there's a link there if you want it. And then another summary of a whole bunch of research by a group in the States called Deans of Impact. I really like this one. Satnam and I know we've talked about it because it has a huge list of people who have signed off on it, of sort of writers, John Hattie, Dylan Williams, Carol Dweck. There's all these like people who agree with everything that's in there. And so it's a really solid foundational document. Okay, so next week we promise we'll finish on time. Thank you for sticking with us. And I'll just go back to these slides here. And just, if you want, these can be some reflection for you. The slides, the recording, and those links, there's a new little button that we've put on the website for this series, deltalearns.ca/powerful practices. And so as soon as it's done, I'll put the video on there and the slides and everything, and you can access anything you need there. All right. We will stop there. We appreciate your patience sticking with us over time. We hope that that's going to set the foundation and pique your interest a little bit. Tell your friends to come, share the videos. And if anyone has any thoughts or questions, we can stick around. And if not, feel free to take off.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.
Jason.
It's a fun launch.
Yeah, we'll get into the practical stuff, fun stuff coming up.
Yeah, hey, Christine and Tricia. Cool to see some primary
Hi.
folks here.
Yeah. Can we get the resources? Is there any way? I just put the question in because there's two of us and we tried really hard to get someone else on staff. And we'll
Sure. What school are you at again?
twins.
Beech Grove.
Beach Grove, that's right. Okay. Yeah, we can get you some.
If you have extra,
Thanks. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I've got a
We'll read
bunch. I'll
them
get-
and we'll talk to each other. So yeah,
Perfect.
take care.
Perfect. Okay.
Nice. All right.
All right. You can stop that recording there, Mr.
Oh, yeah,
Stevenson,
thanks.
so I don't say anything incriminating.